No one can know the truth.
Someone already does.
Who?
On a gray Tuesday morning in Manhattan, Evelyn Hart, the 34-year-old chief executive of Hart Industries, the most feared and most envied woman in corporate New York, slid a single piece of paper across her glass desk. It was a check, $50 million, made out to a man she had exchanged maybe 100 words within 3 years, her driver, Marcus Reed. She was not asking him to marry her. She was asking him to pretend. For one weekend, at her younger sister's wedding, in front of a family that had never once believed she was capable of loving anyone, Marcus would have to become her fiancé. He had 30 seconds to decide. What neither of them understood yet was that this decision would not only change his daughter's life. It would slowly pull open a secret the Hart family had spent 30 years trying to keep buried. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. To understand how a woman like Evelyn Hart ended up offering a stranger $50 million to fake a relationship, you have to understand the world she came from. Hart Industries had been built by her grandfather from a single textile factory into a logistics empire that touched 4 continents. By the time it reached Evelyn, the company was worth billions, but it came wrapped in rules that had nothing to do with profit margins. The Hart family did not simply inherit money. They inherited expectations, and those expectations were enforced by one woman, Evelyn's grandmother, Vivian Hart, the matriarch who still controlled the largest single share of voting stock from her chair at the head of every family table. A woman who had buried a husband, outlasted 2 recessions, and never once apologized for either. Vivian had not always been the hardened woman the family feared. Decades earlier, she had married a charming, ambitious man everyone assumed adored her, and for a long time, she had believed that too. It took years for her to understand that the warmth she mistook for love was simply his talent for making every room believe whatever he needed it to believe, a talent he used on investors, on rivals, and eventually, without her ever fully realizing it, on her. By the time she understood the difference between being adored and being managed, she had already spent decades quietly absorbing the consequences of decisions he made and never corrected, learning to protect the family name even when protecting it meant staying silent about things that deserved better than silence. Vivian's will had one clause that haunted every family gathering for years. Evelyn would inherit full and uncontested control of Hart Industries on her 35th birthday, but only if she was married or formally engaged by that date. If not, controlling interest would transfer to her cousin Whitney, a woman who had spent a decade quietly campaigning for exactly that outcome, sitting on committees, attending every gala, positioning herself as the responsible alternative long before anyone admitted that was what she was doing. Evelyn's 35th birthday fell on the same weekend as her younger sister Charlotte's wedding, which meant the entire family, every aunt, every cousin, every board member with a personal stake in the outcome, would be gathered under one roof to watch whether Evelyn finally had someone, or whether she had failed one final, very public test. Most people who worked for Evelyn assumed her coldness was simply who she was. They did not know about Adrian Cole. 6 years earlier, Evelyn had been engaged to Adrian, a rising consultant from a respected New York family, a match everyone called perfect, right down to the matching monograms on the save-the-date cards. 3 weeks before their wedding, she discovered he had been quietly negotiating a position at a rival firm using insider details from conversations she trusted him with. Conversations about supplier contracts she had shared with him in bed, in confidence, never imagining they would end up in someone else's pitch deck. The engagement ended in a single afternoon, in a conference room, with lawyers present, because Evelyn refused to have the conversation anywhere her own staff might see her cry. The embarrassment lingered for years, replayed at every family dinner in the form of careful, pitying questions about whether she had met anyone new. Evelyn learned to answer those questions with silence and a closed laptop, and the family slowly stopped asking, assuming she had simply chosen the company over love. What none of them knew was that Evelyn had tried, twice, quietly, with men who had no idea who her family was, and both times had found herself counting the minutes until she could leave, certain that the moment they learned the truth about her name, they would start looking at her the way Adrian eventually had, like a useful asset rather than a person. Marcus Reed's story began nowhere near a boardroom. He had been 2 years into an architecture degree when his mother's illness forced him to leave school and find work that paid immediately, the kind of work that did not care about half-finished transcripts. He never went back. By the time he started driving for Hart Industries, he was 31, raising his daughter Lily alone after her mother left when Lily was a toddler, walking out one morning with a single suitcase and a note that said she was not built for this life, leaving Marcus to figure out exactly what kind of life he was supposed to build instead. Lily was 7 years old and had a congenital heart condition that required a procedure their insurance only partially covered, a fact Marcus had learned sitting in a pediatric cardiologist's office with a folder of numbers that did not move no matter how many times he recalculated them. He worked 2 jobs around his driving schedule, picked Lily up from school whenever he could, and kept a quiet, careful distance from the kind of life Evelyn Hart lived, a life that to him looked less like freedom and more like a very expensive, very lonely cage. On the nights he worked his second job, restocking shelves at a warehouse until 2 in the morning, he kept a photo of Lily taped inside his locker, a reminder of exactly why none of it was optional. Marcus's decency rarely announced itself, but it showed up in small, consistent ways that no one was paying him to perform. He once spent an entire Saturday helping an elderly neighbor in his building track down a missing pension check after her landlord ignored 3 separate complaints, refusing the $20 she tried to press into his hand afterward. He kept a folder in his car with extra granola bars and bus fare for the regulars he saw outside the office building every morning, not because anyone asked him to, but because he remembered what it felt like to need exactly that kind of small mercy and not receive it. None of this made it into any background check Whitney would eventually order. It simply made him who he was. For 3 years, Marcus had driven Evelyn to board meetings, airports, and family dinners she dreaded attending. He noticed things other people missed because they were too busy being intimidated by her. He noticed that she always checked on the building's night security guard by name before leaving the office, asking about his grandchildren, remembering details she never repeated to anyone else. He noticed she canceled 3 meetings in 1 month around the anniversary of her grandfather's death, and that she never explained why, simply asked Marcus to drive slower past the old factory site, without saying anything at all. He noticed she watched families in the park sometimes, just for a second too long, before looking away, and once, only once, he saw her wipe her eyes quickly before stepping out of the car, and pretended he had seen nothing. Evelyn, for her part, had stopped seeing him as background noise sometime during the 2nd year, though she would never have admitted it, not even to herself, and certainly not to him. She noticed the way he kept a child's drawing taped to his visor, faded from sunlight. She noticed he never complained. Even on the nights, she kept him waiting outside a meeting for 3 extra hours without apology. She noticed, on one rare afternoon when traffic stalled them both in silence for 40 minutes, that he had a way of answering her questions honestly, without flattery, that none of her board members had managed in years. She told herself none of it meant anything. She was, by then, very practiced at telling herself that. The night Evelyn decided to make Marcus an offer began with a phone call from her mother, Margaret, reminding her, not for the first time, that the entire family would be watching at Charlotte's wedding to see if Evelyn had finally grown up. Margaret's words were polite, the way they always were, but the meaning underneath them was sharp enough to cut, each sentence a small, well-aimed reminder of every year Evelyn had spent disappointing people who loved her in their own complicated way. Evelyn sat alone in her office long after the call ended, staring at the Will's clause printed out on her desk, the deadline circled in red ink by an assistant who had no idea what it actually meant to her. And for the first time in a long time, she let herself imagine what it would feel like to simply lose, publicly, in front of everyone. She thought about hiring an actor through an agency, the way certain executives quietly did for events like this, but dismissed it almost immediately. An actor would perform a relationship convincingly for an audience that did not know her. Her family would see through anyone who had not actually spent time learning who she was, and Whitney, sharp-eyed and patient, would find the cracks within a single dinner. She needed someone who already knew small, specific, unglamorous truths about her life, someone who had been present for 3 years without ever once being asked his opinion. By midnight, she had made a decision that surprised even herself, one built less on calculation than on quiet desperation, and somewhere underneath the desperation, something else she did not yet have a name for. When Marcus arrived for his usual morning shift, Evelyn asked him to come inside instead of waiting in the car. He assumed, at first, that he was being let go and ran through the numbers in his head automatically. Severance, unemployment, how many weeks that would buy Lily. She did not soften the request when it came. She told him directly that she needed someone to pose as her fiancé for one weekend at her sister's wedding, that the arrangement would end the moment the weekend did, and that she would pay him $50 million for his discretion and his performance. Marcus assumed it was a joke until she slid the check across the desk, and even then, he stared at it for a long moment without speaking, certain there was a version of this conversation that made more sense than the one actually happening. He told her no. The word came out before he had fully thought it through, an instinct built from years of being careful around people who could afford to be careless with him. He told her he had a daughter who needed him reliable, not entangled in something that could blow up his entire life over a single weekend favor. Evelyn did not argue. She simply nodded, said she understood, and told him the offer would remain open until the next morning if he changed his mind, then asked him to drive her home as though nothing had happened at all. The silence in the car that evening was the longest either of them could remember. Marcus changed his mind at 11 that night, sitting beside Lily's hospital bed after a sudden fever sent them to the emergency room, a fever that turned out to be nothing serious, but that reminded him, sharply, how little margin he actually had. He thought of the surgery fund that grew by a few $100s a month no matter how many extra shifts he picked up. He thought of every account he had drained twice already. By the time the fever broke and Lily fell back asleep, he had decided that pride was a luxury he could not currently afford, and that $50 million, attached to one uncomfortable weekend, was not a temptation he had any real right to refuse. Marcus called Evelyn before sunrise and said yes, but only after laying down conditions of his own. He wanted the money placed immediately into a trust for Lily's medical care, regardless of what happened at the wedding. He wanted Evelyn to understand that he was not for sale beyond the role she was asking him to play, and that his daughter would never know the truth behind where the money came from. Evelyn agreed without hesitation, slightly unsettled by how firmly he negotiated terms most people in his position would have simply accepted. A family lawyer drew up a formal agreement within 2 days, signed quietly in a conference room with no one else present. Two people who barely knew each other now bound by a secret neither fully understood the weight of yet. The 2 weeks before the wedding were spent in quiet, deliberate preparation. Evelyn briefed Marcus on family names, old arguments, inside jokes he would need to understand to survive a weekend of scrutiny, drawing diagrams of family relationships on a whiteboard like a woman preparing for a hostile board meeting rather than her own sister's wedding. She had him fitted for clothes that fit a man who had never owned a tailored suit, and the transformation unsettled her more than she expected when he stepped out of the fitting room, and she found herself, briefly, unable to think of anything to say at all. A dance instructor was brought in for 2 evenings, since Margaret would absolutely expect a first dance moment at the reception, and Marcus, it turned out, was a far better student than Evelyn anticipated, careful and quick to learn, the same quiet attentiveness he brought to every other part of his life. One evening, Evelyn arranged a private dinner at her apartment solely to test whether Marcus could survive a formal table setting without drawing attention to himself, something Margaret was certain to scrutinize given her well-known opinions about cutlery. Marcus reached for the wrong fork twice in the first 10 minutes, prompting Evelyn to laugh out loud for the second time that month, an unguarded sound that surprised her almost as much as it surprised him. By the end of the evening, he had the sequence memorized perfectly, reciting it back to her with a dry seriousness that made her laugh again, and neither of them mentioned how comfortable the apartment had started to feel with 2 people in it instead of 1. They staged a single public test run, a dinner at a restaurant frequented by exactly the kind of society photographers who fed gossip columns, deliberately chosen so that word would reach the family before the wedding and make their arrival less suspicious. It worked better than either of them expected. A photo of them laughing over dessert appeared online within hours, captioned with breathless speculation about Manhattan's most private executive finally settling down, and Evelyn felt something close to panic watching strangers construct an entire romance out of 40 minutes of careful performance. Margaret texted within the hour, thrilled, already asking questions about timelines no one had prepared answers for, and the pressure that had been theoretical until that point suddenly became very real. A formal engagement photo session followed 2 days later, arranged hastily by Margaret, who insisted the family album could not simply rely on a blurry restaurant photo taken by a stranger with a phone. The photographer, unaware that anything about the couple in front of his camera was invented, kept commenting on how naturally they moved together, how he rarely needed to direct couples who already understood each other's timing so well. Marcus rested a hand lightly at the small of Evelyn's back for one frame, an unscripted instinct rather than opposed instruction, and Evelyn found herself leaning into it slightly before she had consciously decided to. Neither of them mentioned it afterward, though both of them remembered exactly which photograph it was when the prince arrived a week later. Their rehearsed conversations, meant only to establish a believable backstory, kept drifting into real ones, about his daughter, about her grandfather, about things neither of them usually said out loud to anyone. Marcus asked, once, carefully, why she had never simply told her family the truth about Adrian instead of letting them assume she had chosen work over love. Evelyn did not have a good answer, only that admitting the truth would have meant admitting she had been fooled, and fooled was a word the Hart family did not forgive easily. Neither admitted it, but the line between performance and something else had already begun to blur, somewhere between the dance lessons and the late-night phone calls that had stopped being strictly about logistics weeks earlier. The Hart family estate sat on 40 acres in the Hudson Valley, a property that had hosted every major family event for 3 generations, its gates flanked by stone pillars that had outlived 2 generations of arguments about who actually deserved to inherit them. When Evelyn's car pulled through with Marcus beside her instead of behind the wheel, heads turned before they had even stepped out. Margaret greeted them with a smile that did not quite reach her eyes, immediately steering Marcus toward a cluster of ants eager to inspect him. Charlotte, radiant and distracted with her own wedding only 2 days away, hugged Marcus immediately, delighted that her sister had finally brought someone home, while an uncle on the porch loudly announced that he had already lost money betting Evelyn would arrive alone again this year. An uncle named Walter, technically retired but unofficially the family's self-appointed master of ceremonies for every gathering, mistook Marcus for the wedding's hired valet within the first 5 minutes and handed him a set of car keys before Charlotte hurriedly corrected him, mortified, while Marcus simply smiled and handed the keys back without comment. The estate's longtime wedding planner, a brisk woman named Diane who had organized every Hart family event for 15 years, pulled Evelyn aside almost immediately to confirm seating arrangements, glancing at Marcus with the practiced, evaluating look of someone who had seen a great many fiancés come and go at this particular house, and clearly reserving judgment until she had watched him through at least one full dinner. Whitney watched from the porch with her arms crossed, saying nothing, though her eyes lingered on Marcus a beat too long, the way someone studies a puzzle piece that does not quite match the picture on the box. She had spent 10 years building a quiet case for why she, not Evelyn, deserved control of the company, gathering small grievances and larger ones, and the sudden, convenient appearance of a fiancé 2 weeks before a deadline that decided billions of dollars struck her immediately as a story that needed checking rather than celebrating, regardless of how happy Charlotte appeared to be about it. Dinner that first night was where the questions began. Margaret asked how they met, and Evelyn answered smoothly, the story rehearsed and clean, describing a slow friendship built over years of long drives that had quietly become something more. An aunt asked what Marcus did for work, and there was a half-second of silence before he answered, carefully, that he worked in transportation logistics, technically true, deliberately vague, a phrase Evelyn had specifically chosen with him during their preparation sessions. Whitney asked a sharper question about his family, his background, where he had grown up, and Marcus felt the room's attention settle on him fully for the first time. He answered honestly about his daughter, about leaving school early, and watched Margaret's polite smile falter slightly at the mention of a child from a previous relationship, a detail no one had been told to expect. Across the table, Vivian Hart said nothing at all, watching the exchange with an expression no one at the table could quite read, her fork resting untouched against her plate for several long minutes. She asked only one question that evening, late, almost as an afterthought, asking Marcus what his mother's name had been. The question landed oddly in the middle of an otherwise ordinary conversation about wedding flowers, and Marcus answered without thinking much of it, never noticing the way Vivian's hand tightened slightly around her water glass, or the way she changed the subject immediately afterward, asking Charlotte about caterers as though nothing unusual had happened at all. Adrian Cole arrived the next morning as a groomsman, an old family friend who had remained close to Charlotte even after his engagement to Evelyn collapsed, walking into the breakfast room with the same easy confidence that had once convinced an entire family he was harmless. His presence put Evelyn on edge in a way she had not fully prepared for, old humiliation resurfacing the moment he greeted her with a kiss on the cheek and a comment about how well she looked, said in a tone that suggested he expected her to still care what he thought. Adrian greeted Marcus with a handshake just a little too firm, a smile just a little too curious, and within minutes was asking questions that sounded friendly but were not, questions designed to find the seams in a story that had been stitched together in less than 2 weeks. Adrian cornered Evelyn alone later that afternoon, near the garden where Charlotte's wedding arch was being assembled, and asked, without much pretense, whether the engagement was as sudden as it appeared, whether she had simply panicked under the will's deadline and found the nearest available man. Evelyn told him, coldly, that unlike him, she did not need to manufacture anything to get what she wanted, and walked away before he could answer, hands shaking slightly in a way she hoped he had not noticed. It was the first time in years she had spoken to him without rehearsing the sentence beforehand, and it left her unsettled for reasons that had less to do with Adrian than she wanted to admit. Margaret found Evelyn alone in her childhood bedroom that evening, sitting on the edge of a bed she had not slept in for over a decade, and asked, quietly, without the usual social performance, whether Evelyn was actually happy, or whether this was simply another version of the success she had always been so good at producing on command. Evelyn started to give her practiced answer and stopped halfway through, surprising herself by admitting that she honestly did not know yet that this weekend had already shown her things about herself she had spent years avoiding. Margaret did not push further. She simply sat beside her daughter for a long moment in silence, the kind of silence that, for the first time in years, did not feel like disappointment. That afternoon, away from the rest of the family, Evelyn and Marcus found a few private minutes near the old stone bridge at the edge of the property, the one place on the estate neither of them had been briefed to avoid in their preparation sessions. The conversation started as rehearsal, checking details before the next family event, but it slipped quickly into something unscripted. Evelyn admitted, for the first time to anyone, how exhausting it was to be measured constantly against a version of success that had nothing to do with happiness. Marcus admitted how strange it felt to step, even briefly, into a world where money solved every problem except the ones that actually mattered. Neither of them moved closer, but something in the space between them had changed, quietly, undeniably, and both of them noticed. The arrangement nearly unraveled the following morning when Marcus's regular babysitter canceled with no notice, leaving him no choice but to ask his sister to bring Lily to the estate for a few hours until he could arrange something else. Evelyn had not prepared for this. The contract had said nothing about meeting a 7-year-old, and she found herself standing awkwardly in the estate's kitchen while Lily, unimpressed by titles or wealth, asked her bluntly why she talked so much like a teacher. Evelyn laughed before she could stop herself, the first unguarded laugh anyone at that estate had heard from her in years, and spent the next hour sitting on the kitchen floor, helping Lily build a tower out of sugar cubes while Marcus watched from the doorway, quietly recalculating everything he had assumed about how this weekend was supposed to go. Whitney did not let the question of Marcus's background go. By that evening, she had quietly hired a private investigator under the pretense of simple due diligence given the size of the family's holdings and the seriousness of an engagement. Whitney's first instinct was to follow the money, certain that a sudden $50 million fiancé must be hiding gambling debts or a secret family demanding payment. The investigator found nothing of the sort, only a single, recent, unusually large transfer into a trust account benefiting a minor, which Whitney initially assumed was proof of some hidden child support arrangement Marcus had failed to mention, a discovery she nearly brought to the family table before deciding to wait for full confirmation first. It was only on a second pass through Marcus's records, This one focused on employment and family history rather than finances, that the investigator found something Whitney had not been looking for at all. The report came back noting that his late mother had once been employed at this exact estate decades earlier, listed only as a personal assistant, with no further detail beyond an abrupt termination date and no severance recorded. Whitney did not yet understand what it meant, but she understood enough to know it was a thread worth pulling, especially with the family's biggest weekend of the year only one day away. The rehearsal dinner that night nearly exposed everything. An aunt, attempting to be charming, asked Marcus to recount the story of his and Evelyn's first kiss, a detail they had never actually prepared an answer for, assuming no one would ask something so specific so early. Marcus hesitated half a second too long, and Evelyn, watching from across the table, felt her stomach drop as Whitney's eyes sharpened with interest. Marcus recovered smoothly, inventing a quiet, believable moment involving a delayed flight and an airport lounge, delivered with enough warmth that the table moved on satisfied. But Evelyn caught his eye afterward and saw, for just a second, the same flicker of fear she had been carrying all weekend, the understanding that one careless answer could undo everything. Charlotte noticed something was wrong later that night, finding her sister sitting alone on the back porch long after the rehearsal dinner had ended, and asked, gently, if everything between her and Marcus was actually all right, since she had seen the brief flash of panic cross Evelyn's face during the toast about their first kiss. Evelyn nearly told her everything in that moment. The offer, the contract, the slow unraveling of a lie that no longer felt entirely like one, but stopped herself at the last second, telling Charlotte only that weddings made everyone a little more anxious than they expected. Charlotte did not fully believe her, but let it go, gently squeezing her sister's hand before heading back inside, leaving Evelyn alone with a truth she still was not ready to say out loud to anyone except, perhaps, Marcus himself. Whitney raised what she had found the next evening, at a smaller family gathering before the final preparations for the wedding, phrasing her discovery as polite curiosity rather than accusation. She mentioned Marcus's mother's name, the old position at the estate, and watched the table's reaction carefully. Margaret looked uncomfortable. Evelyn looked confused, genuinely, since Marcus had never mentioned any of it to her either. Marcus himself sat still for a long moment before admitting he knew almost nothing about his mother's early life, only that she had rarely spoken of the years before he was born, and that she had died without explaining why. The silence that followed was heavier than anything that had been said all weekend. It was Vivian who finally broke that silence, quietly asking Marcus to walk with her after dinner. Away from the rest of the family, in the dim light of the estate's old library, surrounded by portraits of heart men who had built fortunes none of them had fully earned alone, she told him a story she had never told anyone outside the family. Decades earlier, his mother had been blamed for a financial discrepancy she had not caused, one Vivian's own husband had created and never corrected, because correcting it would have cost him his reputation. Marcus's mother had been quietly dismissed to protect a man who was never held accountable, given no reference and no explanation, and she had carried that injustice in silence for the rest of her life, raising a son who grew up never knowing why his mother flinched whenever wealth was mentioned in their small apartment. Vivian also admitted something else that night, something that reframed everything Marcus and Evelyn believed about why this arrangement had ever come together. She had suspected for weeks that the engagement was not real, not because Evelyn was a poor liar, but because she had seen the same hollow performance in her own marriage decades earlier and recognized its shape instantly. The careful distance, the rehearsed affection, the way two people could share a room without ever truly sharing anything else. She had allowed the charade to continue anyway, curious whether her granddaughter, faced with someone she could not simply intimidate or outwork, might accidentally discover something she had spent her whole life avoiding. The will's deadline, she confessed, had never really been about marriage at all. It had been a test of whether Evelyn could let anyone close enough to matter. Marcus left that conversation carrying two truths at once: that his presence in this family's history went back further than anyone had told him, and that the woman he was supposed to be performing affection for had somehow become someone he genuinely did not want to leave at the end of the weekend. He did not tell Evelyn everything Vivian had said that night, uncertain how to hand her a truth that implicated her own family without also implicating the fragile, complicated thing growing between them. He told her only that her grandmother knew, and watched her go pale in a way that had nothing to do with the wedding planning still left to finish before morning. Adrian found out about the contract the next day, almost by accident, overhearing a tense phone call between Marcus and the family lawyer confirming the trust documents for Lily's surgery. He pieced together enough to understand the arrangement was financial and confronted Marcus privately near the stables, suggesting that for the right price, he could simply forget what he had overheard, or alternatively, make sure the entire family heard it during tomorrow's reception. Marcus told him, without raising his voice, that he had grown up with men like Adrian deciding what people like him were worth, and that he would rather lose every dollar of the arrangement than let Adrian use his daughter's surgery as leverage against anyone. Adrian left the conversation unsettled and used to being refused so calmly. The morning of the wedding arrived heavy with everything neither Evelyn nor Marcus had said out loud yet. Evelyn stood in front of a mirror in her childhood bedroom, the same room where she had once practiced wedding vows for an engagement that fell apart before it ever reached an altar, and found herself, for the first time, genuinely frightened of how much she wanted this particular lie to somehow become true. Marcus, dressing in a guest room down the hall, thought of his mother's name spoken aloud in that library, of Adrian's threat near the stables, of Lily's safely back at home with his sister, and decided that whatever happened today, he was done pretending the feelings underneath the arrangement were not real. The ceremony itself passed without incident, Charlotte radiant. The family momentarily united in the kind of joy that made old tensions easier to ignore. Vows exchanged under the same garden arch Evelyn had stood near days earlier during her tense conversation with Adrian. For a few hours, watching her sister marry a man who had never once made her feel like a transaction, Evelyn allowed herself to set down the weight of the entire weekend, sitting beside Marcus with their hands quietly intertwined, neither of them performing anything at all for the length of the ceremony. The reception opened gently enough, with Charlotte's new father-in-law offering a warm, rambling toast about patience and timing that drew easy laughter, and one of Charlotte's college friends following with a story so sentimental it left half the room reaching for napkins. Margaret took her turn next, raising a glass to her daughters, both of them, with a warmth in her voice that surprised Evelyn slightly, thanking the room for finally getting to see both her girls happy in the same year. For a few minutes, watching her mother's genuine, unguarded joy, Evelyn allowed herself to believe the rest of the evening might pass exactly as easily. It was at the reception, during the toasts, that everything threatened to come apart. Adrian, never one to let an opportunity pass quietly, rose with a glass in hand and a comment dressed as a joke, referencing how quickly Evelyn had found a fiancé after years of being famously unavailable, and how convenient the timing was given the will's deadline. Whitney, sensing an opening she had been preparing for all weekend, added her own remark moments later about transportation logistics and unanswered questions about Marcus's family history, loud enough for half the room to hear clearly, watching Margaret's face carefully for the reaction she had been anticipating. Evelyn stood up before she had fully decided to. The room quieted, expecting her usual composed deflection, the kind of answer that had protected her at 100 family events before this one. Instead, she told the truth, all of it, the offer, the agreement, the $50 million, watching her mother's face go pale and Whitney's smile freeze in place mid-sentence. But she did not stop there. She told them that somewhere between the rehearsed conversations and the quiet drive home from this estate, what started as an arrangement had become something she was not prepared to lose, and that whatever they thought of how it began, what she felt for Marcus now was entirely real, more real than anything she had felt since long before any of them remembered her smiling easily. Marcus stood beside her, and for the first time all weekend, he was not performing anything. He told the family, calmly, about his mother, about the years she carried an injustice no one ever corrected, about coming to this house already certain he would leave it exactly the way he arrived, unattached and unaffected. Then he said that Evelyn had made that impossible, not because of the money, which he reminded them was already designated entirely for his daughter regardless of how this moment ended, but because she was the first person in years who had looked at him and seen more than what he did for a living, and that he intended to stay, with or without anyone's approval. Vivian was the one who finally spoke into the silence that followed, rising slowly from her chair at the head of the table with the same composure she had carried through every family crisis for 50 years. She told the family that she had known the engagement was invented from nearly the beginning, and that she had let it continue because she wanted to see what her granddaughter would do when faced with the one thing money could never script, an honest feeling. She turned to Margaret and to Whitney and told them, plainly, that the will's deadline was satisfied, not by a piece of paper, but by what she had just watched happen in front of an entire family. Whitney said nothing, her case for the company quietly collapsing in real time. Margaret, for the first time in years, cried. Charlotte found her sister alone near the garden a short while later, still in her wedding dress, and told Evelyn she was not angry, only sorry that Evelyn had ever felt this was the only way to be taken seriously by their own family. The two sisters sat together until the reception music started again inside, talking honestly for the first time in years about expectations neither of them had ever asked for, but both had spent their entire lives trying to satisfy. It was a small, quiet moment compared to everything that had happened at dinner, but for Evelyn, it mattered more than almost anything else that weekend. Whitney did not speak to Evelyn again until 3 weeks later, calling unannounced and asking, awkwardly, if they could meet for coffee away from any other family members. She admitted, haltingly, that she had spent so many years trying to be the version of competence Vivian seemed to respect that she had stopped noticing when her own suspicion had curdled into something closer to resentment, aimed less at Evelyn specifically than at a family that had never once made either of them feel secure without constant performance. She did not ask for forgiveness exactly, only acknowledgement, and Evelyn, surprising herself, offered both, recognizing in her cousin's discomfort a version of the same exhausting standard she had spent her own life trying to satisfy. In the weeks that followed, the $50 million remained exactly where Marcus had insisted it go from the start, into a trust securing Lily's surgery and her future, untouched by the public confession that had followed it. Evelyn offered repeatedly to do more, and Marcus refused every time, accepting only what had already been agreed to before either of them knew the arrangement would become real. Their relationship grew slowly, deliberately, away from cameras and board meetings, built on conversations that no longer needed an audience or a script, Lily eventually meeting Evelyn properly over pancakes on a Saturday morning, asking again why she still talked like a teacher, and laughing when Evelyn admitted she had never quite figured out how to stop. Hart Industries continued under Evelyn's full control, but the woman running it was noticeably different, quicker to listen, slower to assume the worst of people who had less than she did, and the first item she personally approved that quarter was a quiet, formal correction to her late grandfather's old financial records, restoring Marcus's mother's name to the company history with the apology it had been owed for 30 years. Vivian Hart passed away peacefully 18 months later, having lived just long enough to see her granddaughter married, not to satisfy a clause in a will, but because she had chosen to, in a small ceremony at the same estate where the lie had first been told. On a quiet afternoon the following spring, Marcus and Evelyn drove out together to the small cemetery where his mother was buried, a modest plot Marcus had visited alone for years without ever bringing anyone else along. Evelyn stood beside him in silence while he set down flowers, and after a long moment, she told him that the company had formally restored his mother's name to its records, not as a gesture for the cameras, but because some debts, however late, were still worth paying honestly. Marcus did not say much in response, only reached for her hand the way he had on the morning of the wedding, and for the first time, neither of them needed a script to know exactly what the moment meant. Marcus eventually returned to finish the architecture degree he had abandoned years earlier, studying in the evenings while Evelyn quietly rearranged her own schedule to be home for dinner more nights than not, a small adjustment that meant more to both of them than either ever said aloud. Lily grew up healthy, never knowing the full story behind the trust that had once changed her life, only that her father had married a woman who treated her like family from the very first day they met. What began as $50 million and a desperate, calculated lie had quietly become something neither of them had been looking for, and something money, on its own, had never been able to buy.